That is to say that what we find running through history is a variety of worldview traditions. A variety of worldview traditions. If you like, philosophical naturalism, explaining everything in terms of physical processes. Some kind of idealism or pantheism, as in the Neoplatonic tradition. And theism, whether Christian, Jewish, Muslim, different worldview traditions. And we've been noticing how the other variable that stands out in the course of history is changing conceptual models drawn from the science of the day. And what we've been tracing really thus far is simply the way in which Greek science, represented by the Platonic Pythagorean and the Aristotelian sciences, with their theories of forms, how those Greek sciences contributed to the shaping of the philosophical work in all of these traditions. Okay? Though admittedly it's much more evident in the idealist and in the theist than in the naturalist at that juncture. Where if you want a point of reference in the naturalism, you have to go, I suppose, either to Democritus, the Epicureans, or to the Stoics, naturalists. Though the Stoics are sort of naturalistic pantheists. Well, now that kind of arrangement is breaking down. That's what is one of the revolutionary things about Occam, you see. Because the rejection of realistic theories of forms is saying, no, we don't want to work with those guys. And there is a scientific revolution going on. But it's going on first philosophically in terms of the internal disruption of the scholastic philosophy represented by Occam. And Occam is 14th century, at which time you have only the bare bones beginning of empirical work that led to the mechanistic science. You see. After all, Newton is 17th century. You see, Galileo, 16th century. But in addition to the philosophical breakup, there is the scientific revolution itself a-brewing. And you find comments on that in Stumpf that you'll want to take note of. We don't need to go into it particularly. Except to underscore again that the basic ideas are that of matter in motion. And talking of matter in motion invokes two other concepts. One, the concept of absolute space. That is to say, a uniform extent of space, infinite in all directions. Absolute space, within which matter can move. But also time. A uniform and endless duration of time within which change and motion occurs. So you have four key concepts. Matter, the forces that produce motion, absolute space, absolute time. And of course, if you go back to the Greek model, that means rejecting formal and final causes, keeping just material and efficient causes. Okay? Now, be careful not to make a further jump and say that the new science was completely empirical. The fact is that what we're going to be tracing is two different scientific and philosophical movements in modern times. One of which is basically an empirical tradition, and the other of which, being more mathematically oriented, is more of a rationalistic tradition from an epistemological standpoint. The empirical tradition begins with Bacon, Francis Bacon, not Chancellor of England, but a statesman in Elizabeth I, James I of England. Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, of English Civil War times, political thinker, John Locke, George Berkeley, David Hume. It is Bacon who first introduced inductive methods, formulated those inductive methods. Except, interestingly enough, there are anticipations of them that William of Ockham formulates. And Bacon seems to be in some way indebted to that. This, you notice, is basically British. Bacon, Locke, Berkeley, Irish, Hume, Scottish. So I say British, not English. You see. So this is sometimes called British empiricism. On the other hand, you have Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. Descartes, French. Spinoza, a Spanish Jew living in the Netherlands. Leibniz, a German statesman writing in French or Latin. And these are obviously continental Europeans, so this is sometimes known as Continental Rationalism. Well, the British tradition is influenced, you see, by the inductive methods of Bacon, which gets it going. The continental tradition is influenced by the mathematical methods of Descartes, who got it going. You see? And what happens is that as these two run into respective kinds of problems, some of which were sketched out by Willard on Wednesday night, an attempt arises to bring the two together in a curious way by Immanuel Kant. Critique of Pure Reason, 1781. Big date. So that in the 19th century you get two very different traditions. You get German idealism in people like Hegel, and you get British and French German positivism in people like John Stuart Mill. And in the 20th century, well, it's largely a continuation of the empiricist tradition in Anglo-American philosophy, and largely a continuation of the continental tradition still in the continental philosophy. Further development from those beginnings. Now, what we're going to be doing in the remainder of this semester is taking it up to about 1800. Therefore, Bacon and Hobbes, Locke, Berkeley, Hume. Did I say Locke, Berkeley, Hume? Oops. Bacon and Hobbes, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz. Okay. Which takes it up to around 1700. Did I say 1800? Oops, again. 1700. Okay. 1700. So keep in mind, one, the breakdown of the scholastic approach over the problem of universals, which led to the separation of philosophy from theology. Notice how Thomas was doing philosophical theology all the way through and theologically oriented philosophy. You see? And those two now seem to fall apart because there isn't the metaphysic which bonded them together. The glue is gone. You see? And instead of philosophy then being guided by theology, what's going to happen in the 17th and 18th century is that it becomes guided by science. The methods are the methods of science. The model they're using is the model of the science. You see? And so the relationship between revelation and reason breaks down. And what you have instead is a relationship, is a conception of reason, rather, that is defined in terms of scientific knowledge. And the ideal of scientific knowledge becomes the ideal for modern philosophy, modeled on scientific types knowledge. Okay, now go one or two steps further. In addition to those two influences, let's take note as well of the richness of the Renaissance. The 16th, 15th, 16th centuries, the kind of renaissance of classical learning which went on. Triggered in measure by the rediscovery of classical manuscripts, leading in turn to a renaissance of classical scholarship, leading in turn to a renaissance of various kinds of classical philosophy. And particularly influential in the English Renaissance, in the Italian Renaissance, Plato and Neoplatonism. Plato and Neoplatonism. So that even though people like Bacon and Hobbes and Locke want nothing to do with Plato's forms, they all pay their compliments to Plato. You see. So that if you've seen sort of a competition between Plato and Aristotle going on in medieval times, Aristotle now goes into decline, Plato goes into the ascendancy. And the conflict that develops is more between Platonic kind influences and the influences of empirical science. And obviously there's a tension there. So Renaissance philosophy means Platonism. It also means Stoicism. It also means skepticism. Because among the classical texts that were rediscovered were the writings of Sextus Empiricus, the Roman skeptic. His outlines of Pyrrhonism, for instance. And so Pyrrhonic skepticism takes on a new departure, and understandably, not only because of the rediscovery of the texts, but because with the breakdown of the medieval synthesis, the old epistemologies were breaking down. You see? Yeah, if the Thomistic epistemology is about abstracting forms from particulars and thinking analogically about the hierarchy of being and that sort of thing, and you're no longer talking of forms and a hierarchy of being, then what good is the Aristotelian epistemology? In any case, as we mentioned before, the logic of Scotus and Occam is more oriented towards a dialectical criticism of other people's views. than towards the systematic development of syllogistic proofs for this, that, and the other, the way it was in Aristotle and Thomas. You see. And so then, it's not only a change of worldviews, but it's a crisis on the whole notion of rationality and knowledge. And skepticism is a natural possibility at those junctures, and I want to come back to that in a moment. So keep in mind the Renaissance. But concurrent with the Renaissance, you have the Protestant Reformation. And it's a whole fascinating story in itself, the relationship of the Protestant reformers to philosophy in their times. And of all of these, I think the most fascinating, though I think perhaps one of the most mistaken, is Martin Luther. Very interesting. Martin Luther was educated at a German university at Erfurt by nominalists of Ockhamist persuasion. He knew the writings of Occam. And at one stage, relatively early, he called Occam my dear master. Interesting, huh? Oh, he also, there in school, studied Aristotle and the scholastics, and in his early teaching years, he had to teach Aristotle's ethics, and hated the job. There was a stage later on when he advocated eliminating Aristotle from the university curriculum, apart from the logic and rhetoric. The particular difficulty that he had with Aristotle was precisely on the theory of universals, because he was a nominalist. Why was he attracted to nominalism, apart from the fact that he had been taught by nominalists, which is usually the reason people are attracted to things? You see. Why was he attracted to nominalism? Because he shared Occam's jealousy for the sovereignty of God. Voluntarism. You see? Voluntarism. And he was concerned, therefore, about the individual before God. That's the very essence of Martin Luther's justification by faith alone. The individual by act of will is involved. But he also disagreed with Occam over the matter of free will. And perhaps because of some of Occam's nominalist successors, who were more extreme, often people suffer at the hands of their friends more than their enemies. As a result of that, Occam was accused of being Pelagian in his theology. Now, Pelagius, as you may recall, back in the 4th century, was a British monk who had emphasized the free will to the extent that he found it necessary to deny any original hereditary sin that holds us in bondage, and maintained that we are perfectly free to obey God simply by virtue of the influence of the example of Christ in his life and his suffering. Back then in the 4th century, 5th century, so forth, Augustine and others rejected Pelagianism, so that by the time you get to Luther, it's recognized to be certainly heretical, and he accused Occam of the heresy of Pelagianism. Now, how come? Well, that's the interesting point. You see, Occam had suggested out of the medieval emphasis on all creation imitating God and loving God, Occam had suggested that loving God is requisite for salvation. But loving God is a virtue. A virtue is a habit, in Aristotelian language. A habit that can be formed by living under the rule of reason. Well, if that's the case, then reason is necessary for love, which is necessary for salvation, so reason is necessary for salvation. Do you get the dialectical criticism? You think? But God's grace forgives us freely. Reason has nothing to do with salvation. God's grace is not preparing us to love God meritoriously so that we earn salvation, as the Occamists seem to suggest. Rather, God's grace is free forgiveness. And so it was over the question of salvation by grace alone, justification by faith alone, that Luther became so critical of the Occamists. Yes. So his relationship to Occam and Occamism was sort of a love-hate relationship, mixed. On the philosophical side, loving it, but not liking the extreme to which the voluntarism had gone, because of its effect on justification by faith. Well, Luther is interesting, very interesting. John Calvin had written an early work on the Roman Seneca in the Stoic tradition. And of course, Calvin was a lawyer by training, and so he was very much taken with Stoic jurisprudence, Stoic natural law, and he talks of natural law in the Stoic tradition when he's dealing with ethics. So one of the interesting things is that Luther sees natural law in relationship to right reason, like Occam, whereas Calvin sees natural law as invariable and unchanging universally, like the Stoics. You see? Because the Stoics had a metaphysical basis for moral order, different from the Aristotelian one. Erasmus was more the Platonist. Melanchthon was the holdout for Aristotelianism. And so the picture is rather interesting. But there is a thesis about the impact of the Reformation on philosophy that I want to focus on particularly. It's a thesis that's been developed by Richard Popkin. In his book on Skepticism from Erasmus to Descartes. Richard Popkin. Did I say Popkin? I did say Popkin. Pitkin? No, that doesn't sound right. I think Popkin is right. I had Pitkin in my notes, I realized, and I had said Popkin. And I probably said Popkin because I knew Popkin was right and Pitkin was wrong. So, oops, for the third time. Yes, Richard Popkin, Skepticism from Erasmus to Descartes. And he argues for this thesis, that the epistemological vacuum was not simply a vacuum left by the breakdown of the medieval synthesis. It was a breakdown that was left also by the loss of the authoritative interpreter in the church authority. In other words, the Protestant Reformation, in its insistence on scriptura sola, scripture alone having authority, rejected the authority of the church either in interpreting scripture or in speaking on things on which the Scripture does not speak. And so there was the development of uncertainty about how we know. There was the fear of intellectual anarchy, with the idea of the priesthood of believers, each interpreting Scripture for himself. And there was the real possibility, people thought, of therefore the loss of any clear understanding or knowledge. Now, that is what encouraged the rise of skepticism, Popkin claims. The rise of skepticism represented by a French philosopher, Montaigne, who Willard mentioned in passing on Wednesday, and evident in the beginning of Descartes' philosophy, because you remember that Descartes, in his Meditations and his Discourse on Method, decides to begin by posing the skeptical position. There is nothing that we can know without doubt. And he sets himself the task of arguing his way out of skepticism. Now, why do that, if it's not that skepticism is the threat looming over all their heads? You see. And so in that sense, the radical methodological change that came in philosophy with Descartes, where instead of starting with what you believe already, thinking through that, you start with nothing at all and work your way out of that. You see? That radical methodological change, the influence of skepticism because of the intellectual vacuum left by the breakdown not only of medieval scholasticism but also of church authority in the Reformation. It's an interesting kind of thesis, and I think it's correct in terms of the things which worried people at that juncture in history. So then we are launched with that into modern period. And what is it that steps into the epistemological vacuum to save the day? You see, that's the interesting thing. You're going to be reading Francis Bacon for Monday, are you not? You'll find that Francis Bacon talks of certain idols. Interesting term to use when you're talking of wrong ways of thinking. You see. He talks of certain idols about which he is skeptical. You see? They include, traditional philosophies passed down from the past. They include naive observation, popular viewpoints, ideas that are suggested by misuses of language. In other words, he's posing the very kinds of problems which skepticism was concerned with. How are we going to know for sure? And what Bacon does is to propose methods. Methods for empirical learning, inductive, gathering of evidence, drawing conclusions about causes. And what Bacon, in his Elizabethan utopianism, does is to envision a magnificent utopian society built on the new empirical mechanistic science of efficient causes. Yeah. Fascinating stuff. Yes. Well, meantime, over on the continent, and this is about 1600 in both cases, Descartes begins his meditations, his discourse on method, by mapping out the skeptical issue and then proceeding. How does he get out of that? Mathematical methods, the methods of continental science, particularly optics, which was using plane geometry. What is the method of geometrical reasoning? Start with your basic axioms and then your proofs. And that's Descartes' method. So you have two alternative methods proposed to avoid skepticism. The method of empirical science, the method of mathematics. Okay. What is the way of knowing then that replaces the medieval insight drawn from theology to guide the philosophical mind? What is the rule of reason going to be in the Enlightenment but the rule of scientific methods and knowledge? You see. And that, the long story, is what produced the scientific mentality of the 19th and 20th century and the scientific naturalism of our day. No, I don't want to blame it all on Occam. I don't suggest you to. Occam had no idea where this was going. His concerns were other than that. But this is the intriguing story, and we'll get started into it next time.